So we are starting our fourth panel of the day, and we've got some real intellectual firepower here. In this, we're gearing it up, and the topic of this panel is experimentation, and we've been casually talking about how this is all a big experiment. Chris is going to disabuse us of that notion because that's way too imprecise. But it's, you know, if we talk about decision making in a crisis, it sort of resembles what we call fuzzy gambling, or, you know, in a way we're often running an experiment. We're just doing something. We have no idea what we're doing if you think about it. So a good question is, could we then, if it is like an experiment, maybe we can organize it like an experiment. We can actually, you know, make it better rather than trying to rationalize it all. So that was the idea behind this, and of course there's a little more of a backstory behind it because Chris and I, long time ago, Chris wrote a book about pragmatism, and Chris and I thought about how pragmatism as and I'm sure Chris will tell us more about it, can be applied to crisis management. So it's a way of thinking. It's a little different. And Wolfgang also has an interest in pragmatism, I know. And so two people that have thought about this. Sanneke wrote a paper that applying this stuff to the use of face masks. And then we have Reidar, is interested in crisis management. So I should give you the names now, because this sounds like a drinking club or something. We're going to make it official. So we have Chrisopher Ansell, University of California at Berkeley, Department of Political Science, and after being a department chair for what must have seemed like an eternity, he's now free to think and write. And so we're welcoming Chris to our conference. We have Professor Seibel at the University of Konstanz, a long-time friend of Dutch academics, and so we're very happy to have you with us. Sanneke Kuipers, associate professor at the Crisis Center of Leiden University in our campus in The Hague. We have, I've got to say it right, and I don't know, Reidar, are you still in Colombia, or are you back in the Arctics?
No, I'm still in Colombia. I'm going back in 2 weeks' time. Okay,
but he is an associate professor at the Arctic University of Norway, and that sounds really cool, and it is really cool. And then our good friend Fredrik Binander at the National Defense University in Stockholm, and long time director of Chrismark, but Chrismark is named differently now. Yeah, we changed it. Well, we're not going to get into that. So we have a really good panel, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Chris, so just so he doesn't fall asleep on us. We'll get him going, and we also have Martin Lodge, but he's teaching right now at LSE, London School of Economics, but he will be joining us in the sort of the second half of this game. So I'm going to ask the four of you to just kick it off with a sort of a brief statement, and which will, you know, provide food for thought and discussion. And then Fredrik and I will just start the discussion. And we have people here in the audience, we have people online, and we'll see where it goes. So, Chris, good morning, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Arjen, and good morning, everyone. And it's great to be here at a very early time on the west coast of the U.S. So I was going to tell you that if I'm incoherent, please blame it on the early hour, even if it's not true. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Arjen, and thanks for organizing this great event. I guess I'm supposed to be the grumpy one. I'm not really grumpy about experiments. I'm just more, I'm maybe grumpy about treating them too casually, as I'll say a few words here. So generally my point is to get some traction on the idea of experiments during times of crisis. I think we need a good idea of what we mean by experiment. And that's what I'd like to reflect on here. So the term experiment is often used very casually. For example, the first line of a recent New York Times article about the UK's response to COVID reads, quote, "For the last 4 months, Britain has run a grand epidemiological experiment, lifting virtually all coronavirus restrictions, even in the face of high daily rate of infections." So I'm not challenging here the right of the New York Times to describe that as an experiment, but I think used in this way, nearly every action that every country has taken during COVID counts as an experiment. So I think to make analytical progress, we need a crisper understanding of what it means to experiment during a crisis. And in work with Martin Bartenberger on varieties of experimentation, we set out a concept of experiment that is, on the one hand, I think, very broad, fairly broad at least, and that encompasses different types of experimentation, but on the other hand is not so broad that it's synonymous with innovation, change, or novelty. Our definition of an experiment is an intervention taken with the intention of learning from that intervention. An intervention taken with the intention of learning from that intervention. So an experiment is designed with the intention of learning. That's kind of the key point there. Now that definition is obviously very broad, but it's actually in conflict with an influential scholarly discussion of quote unquote social experimentation, or sometimes called real life experimentation that's developed in an interesting way. In the 1980s, and then following on from that, there's been research. Two scholars of technology, Wolfgang Krohn and Peter Weingart, argued that the development of nuclear power was an implicit social experiment, pointing out that the public only learned the lessons of that experiment after the Chernobyl accident. So I'm sure we could have a long discussion just about that claim. But the point I really want to make here, and I'm using that as an example to make the point, is that learning in this case was retrospective. The idea is that the public learned about it after the Chernobyl accident. So the first distinction I want to draw that I find useful is between prospective and retrospective learning. We can take actions during a crisis with the intention of learning. That's what I'll call prospective learning. Or we can draw lessons from those actions that have been taken after the fact, that is retrospective learning. Now, why is this distinction relevant, at least from my point of view? Well, for one reason, I found many articles in the literature on COVID talking about policy experiments and saying that we could learn lessons from natural experiments. For example, just to give you an example what a natural experiment might look like, imagine that California imposed stricter mask policies than neighboring Arizona, which is true in fact. That could be argued to set up a natural experiment that would allow scholars after the fact, retrospectively, to draw inferences about COVID transmission. Okay, so natural experiments are really kind of retrospective learning from my point of view. Okay, the second distinction I'd like to draw is between two different types or styles of experimentation. The first broad type is associated with statistical analysis. You're all very familiar with it. It's about essentially concerned with how we control variables so that we can infer causality. I call that, with Martin, controlled experimentation. You kind of cover a class of experiments like that. And as you probably know, randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are often considered the gold standard of this controlled experimentation. But there's a very different tradition of experimentation that's associated with the tradition of design. And that tradition regards an experiment quite differently. It doesn't think about it in terms of control of variables. It thinks about it in terms of designing a process of iteratively, it's hard to say it this early, iteratively designing and then redesigning something, an action or intervention, based on feedback, a process that's often referred to as prototyping. It's as a kind of a catch-all term for that. Both of these types, both controlled and design experiments, can fit the definition of experimentation as making an intervention with the intention of learning. But it's useful to distinguish between them because they operate according to very different logics, and I think they're often useful for different kinds of purposes. So, for instance, in my search through the literature on COVID, I found a number of examples of the use of survey experiments, which are a type of controlled experimentation, as you might know. And they've been used fairly extensively, according to what I found, to test public communication strategies about COVID. But I also found examples of the use of prototyping, but these were oriented towards different uses. For example, testing crisis response operations, and in particular, or developing them, and in particular for the rapid development of health technologies like masks or ventilators. Okay. The general point that I want to make is that if we want to make progress on understanding experimentation during crisis, and don't want to just talk generally about innovation, of which there's been a lot, we need, I think, a more nuanced understanding of the kinds of experimentation we're talking about, because there's a lot of variation out there, and they imply very different setups and very different purposes. So I suggested that we can start with two key distinctions, one between prospective and retrospective experiments, and another between controlled versus design experiments. So that's, I think I'll end there. I had a little bit more to say, but in the interest of time, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. So some clear laying out conceptually of what we're talking about, and Wolfgang was going to add something to that here shortly. But let's build on that. And Wolfgang, are you ready to proceed? And I think you want to show something, and there it is.
Yeah. Okay. So I am probably the only one who comes up or who breaks the rule and tries to stick to the rules at the same time, because I brought a slide, a single one, and which I was not supposed to do, and I tried to stick to the assigned 7 minutes. And what you see here is the essence of what I propose. So it's a conceptual contribution. I've done research on the adaptability of local administration during the so-called refugee crisis in Germany back in 2015/16, but that's my limited experience as far as empirical work is concerned. And what I suggest here is two things. Basically, it is, without having heard about or read Chris's admonishments, I thought we should take the notion of experiment seriously, in the sense that, according to my very conventional and traditional understanding, it is about control. So you change, you manipulate parameters of structures or processes in the attempt to observe or to achieve either intended or hypothesized outcomes, and in order to do that properly, you should be in control of the framework of the very experiment. And if you transfer this idea to real-world experiments in public policy and public administration, this implies that those who are in charge of decision-making should try to control as much as possible the environment and the processes, they are intentionally manipulating and changing, and there are, and this is the core of my own proposal here, risk factors that are in principle known and that should be taken into account, which I call here controllability risks in crisis management. And there are dimensions of controllability. I mentioned here 5 of them. One is system compatibility. The second one is the center versus periphery phenomenon. And third, tight and loose coupling. Then responsibility versus responsiveness. And finally, system maintenance versus goal attainment. And the argument is that in at least all these dimensions, we do have and we are able to identify, with the help of theory and our insights so far, hypothetical loss of control risks. So there are particular risk zones, and if you apply that to the problem of system compatibility, one should refrain to use experiments and to try to be flexible and to deviate from routines in a way that might delegate what usually is the task of state actors to non-state actors without securing the functional equivalence, what state actors usually do or are supposed to do, which is to observe quality and accountability standards. And my empirical example, which indeed comes from the COVID-19 crisis, is that the German government delegated the task of issuing digital COVID-19 vaccination certificates to pharmacies, and that functions probably and pretty well, while the delegation of tests to makeshift COVID-19 test centers was subject to a large extent of fraudulent behavior and just misuse of public funds. And so the argument here is that at least in Germany, the pharmaceutical sector, the pharmacists themselves, are to some extent semi-public institutions, since they are acting in the form or under the umbrella of so-called public corporations or öffentlich-rechtliche Körperschaft, and so they are not really public institutions, but they're acting basically according to professional rules and according to public accountability standards. So that's an example of an experiment, which it was, but with a relatively high level of system compatibility. Just delegating what is basically a public task and a public jurisdiction to private entities that mushroomed spontaneously, and that, of course, of crisis, does not fulfill that criterion of system compatibility. And this is, of course, something public decision makers may take and should take into account, and when that doesn't happen, then the loss of control is almost inevitable. So I apply the same type of argument to all the other dimensions, and I can't go as much into detail as I did with this first example, and many of those notions are probably known, and I have no footnotes here, I have no reference list, but the center periphery problem was already addressed, by the way, this morning, so it is always not really risk-free, but it comes with a lower risk of failure if something happens in the periphery of a core system, because then, when something undesirable, so to speak, happens, there's a higher chance to keep that under control. So one should delegate that experiment, or the experimental adjustment of public policy and public administration, rather, and especially in times of high pressure and the necessity of quick and smooth decision making, rather to the periphery than to the core of indispensable institutions. Similar with a tight and loose coupling. So loosely coupled systems are less prone to big accidents, so to speak, than tightly coupled systems. This is something we know from the classical literature, especially Charles Perrault and his book on normal accidents, but it might happen just like with the nuclear power plants that were the subject of Charles Perrault's research. It's pretty similar with a pandemic, that a tightly coupled, risk-generating system is connected and has to be coped with by means of a loosely coupled system. And so this is a risk generator in its own right when it comes to a federal system, for example, like the German one, because it takes much time to coordinate one's system in the loosely coupled system. It takes deliberation and a consensus building, and that might prove to be a mismatch to the tightly coupled nature of a virus-based pandemic, which in turn it could be a good reason to tighten the political decision-making system itself, to tighten it and to centralize or re-centralize it for a limited period of time, which is, by the way, the subject of Jörg Schwab's paper of tomorrow. And, likewise, and similar with, not really similar, but a similar dilemmatic status, at least, with the tension between responsibility versus responsiveness, because what is typical for a crisis that stretches over time and is also explicitly perceived as a crisis is that decision makers are under tremendous pressure to do justice to the totally legitimate expectations of the general public, and that might happen, and they might do that at the expense of what, from a professional point of view, we were talking about knowledge expertise, or the expert knowledge earlier today, and this is an indispensable tension, but to sacrifice, so to speak, the values and what needs to be done in terms of responsibility in order to do justice to responsiveness requirements or perceived responsiveness requirements, it could be the way through which an already existing crisis will be aggravated. And finally, system maintenance versus goal attainment. Unlike what we like to assume, especially complex organizations of any type, but particularly so the public sector, are to a large extent concerned and busy with themselves. So they are the caretaker of themselves, so to speak, and they are introverted to that extent. And this is totally legitimate, although it may be the root cause of institutional inertia and a protracted decision-making, which of course is the opposite of what we all like to see in an imminent and acute crisis. But this is exactly the thing that might happen. Again, I cite here the repeated postponement of regularly scheduled intergovernmental conferences in the German federal system, again, in order to reach consensus, at least, consensus-based and COVID-19 measures, while this inevitably happened at the expense of quick and smooth goal attainment. I also cite a counterexample, which was the acceptance of intra-organizational, intra-administrative stress and tensions through the substantial involvement of a volunteer workforce in local administration during the so-called refugee crisis in Germany 6 years ago, where stress and system maintenance system maintenance played a minor role, and goal attainment was what ultimately counted. So I think I did not do justice to what I promised, namely to the remain within the limits of 7 minutes, but I'm done with my presentation.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you. So that was a very learned expose. And let's make it practical. Sanneke, face masks.
Okay, there we go.
All about face masks, folks.
No,
and just saying, you know, everybody is visiting our conference here in Leiden, of course, being from abroad, being kind of confused that there are no face masks in Holland. But
I won't comment on that. But
why not?
maybe later on. I've been reading up a bit on the great works of some of you here on how principled and pragmatist approaches offer ways of taming uncertainty in crises, in search of effect or mitigating impact, and in search of legitimacy. And I combine that with my fascination indeed for face mask policies because they differ so much between countries. I think that's fascinating, really. If you look around you and you see how countries, some started really early and then gave up on face masks, and some only now introduced face masks, and everything in between. So I'm looking for an explanation, actually, in the face of this highly similar uncertainty. My colleague Jeroen Wolbers and I, we looked into the situation of 6 EU member states, all medium-sized, between 10 and 20 million, facing highly similar epidemiological risks, same scarcity of resources, same scientific input, and same lack of certainty. And then their approaches varied widely. So this variation could be, or the policy decisions behind this variation could be maybe characterized as principled versus pragmatists. But then I stumbled across a few problems, of course, in my first attempt to apply that, because it didn't seem to vary that much in the sense of an overarching idea behind the approach, such as that the economy should prevail, or that there's herd immunity as a goal, or that there's zero COVID as a goal. It rather seemed to vary in the way certainty is reduced epistemologically. So the principled approach would then be that only randomized control trials show that face masks matter, or that they only matter in contact with patients. So that's one of the assumptions of what I then call principle. That let's do a thought experiment here. And also, it would be principled to say that face masks are only useful in the hands of medical professionals, which was also a strong statement issued in, for instance, the Netherlands, but also Sweden in the beginning. And that only certified face masks, like these FFP and N95 face masks, would help to reduce infection rates. And then there were the countries with the pragmatist approach, as I see it, that said, well, any face covering will do. Cut up a t-shirt, make your own mask. They also said that it would help to reduce the infection rate even among healthy people, or particularly if, and it later turned out to be, people would be asymptomatic. And also it would be very beneficial if non-professionals would widely use them, so everybody should use face masks. And these two approaches are really opposite, and you really see the pattern in many countries' responses in the first wave of the epidemic. And it seemed to be a way of acting their way out of uncertainty. I think you, Arjen and Chris, formulated pragmatism as acting your way into understanding the environment. This was acting your way out of uncertainty. Let's just try to cover faces and see what happens, versus the opposite stand. We're not going to use face masks because we know from our research that that won't help, so we have to approach this in another way. So they had a completely different view on what was evidence, what was valuable feedback, and what were feasible options. And what was also strongly apparent from the cases is that both communications and decisions on this proved very difficult to backtrack, to deviate from later on. But more difficult so for the principled approach. That seemed to be particularly path-dependent. I think Frederick already said it before, and also the two Swedish colleagues in the communication panel. It was very difficult in Sweden, but also in the Netherlands, to later on say, well, you know, we always said that it was scientifically really not, how do you say? It's bullshit to wear face masks, but we go back on that. We think now that it is a good idea. So it proved to be very path-dependent. And I didn't get that far yet with the paper. As you can see when reading up on it, it does tell the tales of these 6 different countries, and it does tell how these countries differed, and how some, like Czech Republic, initially imposed these face masks, and then let go completely after the first wave, paying a high price for that also. And some countries, like Belgium and Greece, started to lift other restrictions in combination with imposing face masks, which is also very interesting. So I think there's a lot out there to dig into further. Can't wait to find the time to do it.
Well, we're going to see if we can help you a little bit today. So this is a very interesting topic that everybody understands and has experience with from a different country perspective. So we can ask some very interesting questions about that. And but before we get there, we're going to Colombia. Reidar, any face masks there?
Yes, here everybody wears face masks, except indoors, of course, in your own home.
Okay.
But I want to comment a bit on my experience of having started out in Norway with the pandemic there. Later, having moved to Denmark, Copenhagen, for a research stay. I'm still based there for now, and I've been twice to Colombia during the pandemic. So I've kind of observed then all the different, responses, not only in like individual moments in time, but over time, how they have developed. So I want to talk a bit about that, and also about a draft discussion paper I'm working on with a potential PhD student.
Okay, Reidar, please keep it within the 7-minute limit, because this sounds like an extensive journey.
I'm going to try to be brief on the first comment. I'm going to talk a bit about masks, where in Norway we basically, and I mean, I'm going to talk about this from a naturalistic experiment context, where I'm talking about my observations, not really about variables I have manipulated in any way. But in Norway, we basically never wore masks outside of Oslo. I think we very much took the pragmatist approach, especially after the first wave, where only zones where the R number was sufficiently high would have to wear masks. So for example, in Oslo, people wore masks for a long time. Most other places, they didn't. In the Arctic, we had to wear masks for like 10 days until the number got below the threshold again. In Denmark, when I moved there, we had to wear masks at first, and later it was removed, and then they started with this kind of, I think Norway and Denmark are similar in the sense that we very much tried to have like this evidence-based approach. And I think that basically one thing I would tell Sana here is that I think trust has a lot to do with it. That, for example, the Danish government in particular assumes that they can share very specific technical information with citizens and they will comply. For example, that you don't have to wear a mask on the train only when you get on and off. And people who put the mask on, get on the train, sit down, take it off, put it on, get off the train. But I think many governments will trust their citizens to comply with such kind of technical advice. And especially this designations of why this is a good approach. For example, it would be much more pragmatic, just say, wear your mask on the train. Okay, but I think this difference in trust plays a big role. And also, I think that one thing I saw in Norway is that masks are identity forming. You get these communities of people who identify as maskers and those who identify as anti-maskers. And the anti-maskers will not wear the mask even when they are supposed to, and the maskers will wear it even when it's not recommended. So then you get this identity building around it, which also resonates with other research I've done on, for example, the HIV/AIDS crisis, where people identify as being careful or not being careful. So it kind of resonates across these pandemics, like, am I a person that takes care or am I one that takes risks? And it's not only something psychological, like the risk tolerance literature seems to suggest. I believe it's also, in the sociological sense, more something we build identities around, like, am I a risk-taking person or am I a person that identify as very responsible, a good citizen, empathic, these things. So yeah, that's basically my anecdotal experience. And here in Colombia, everybody has been wearing masks, both the first time I visited and also now. And I observe that people do that indoors, outdoors, even like alone in their car. So that's kind of interesting to see that it becomes something that is so normalized, you just always have it on all day, which is a bit strange for me, coming from a place where we haven't worn masks at all, basically. And I think also we can't really use masks that much to compare country outcomes. For example, Sweden is often blamed for not having implemented mask mandates, but Norway also didn't, but the pandemic went much better, but we focused much more on the border than on masks. So it's also like kind of about how we choose different references, I think, for like kind of visualizing the pandemic. And I believe that the border control, for example, in Norway, that we had one of the most closed borders in Europe for a time, had to do with that. It's also a symbolic effect. And that's basically what the paper I'm writing is about, like drawing on the famous paper by Tehart on symbolism, and also how many of these measures are about like visualizing the pandemic, and how we as researchers will have to investigate this, how different countries go about visualizing. And we talk about 6 different initiatives. I think the most interesting one for me has been to study this aspect of sanitizing public spaces, pavements, streets, defecating hallways, and how some countries still do this, whereas most countries don't. WHO doesn't recommend it, but it still kind of continues as a popular measure. And I think as researchers, we need to look into are some measures well and alive despite a very thin evidence base, and like it can really be connected to the epidemiological situation, because it happens even in places where infection rates are very low. But it's kind of, I think in the sociological sense, we would have to think about how those measures serve mainly to keep the pandemic image alive in a way, to remind people of the continued existence of the pandemic, in the same way that we have these stickers on the floors keep your distance. Like they are there mainly to keep the pandemic alive, since we can't observe it. We can't observe the virus around us, so we observe it through these means. And comparing how governments communicate this, I think is interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, we've have as a central empirical object, and it kind of keeps us together, so to speak, with all these theoretical notions, the face masks, and we're talking about experiments, and one could say that governments have been running, maybe not the type of experiment that Chris was outlining that precisely, but at least sort of trying or not trying. Does this work, or should we? But when I say that, Fredrik, you've been advising governments, not governments, the government of Sweden, during crisis and before crisis. And is this a notion in real life? I mean, obviously we're academics just playing around, but in real life, is this a notion of saying, we really don't know what we're doing? We're really experimenting, and let's just try something and then see what happens. Do you recognize this at all?
I think that when decision makers feel courageous, they sometimes talk about, doing trial and error. We are so in control of this situation that we can actually see what works and what doesn't. So in my mind, that's a sign of hubris when decision makers start talking about how they experiment. I think Chris has a very good point. If it's going to mean something, it has to have a content. Because I also think that the backside of that is that there's a metaphorical use of experiments that implies, a guinea pig. And there's an ethical issue here that once you start realizing, yeah, that's around 2, it becomes very difficult to actually be doing and designing experiments if you're a democratic institution and not some guy in a white coat, that has an ethical framework that they need to respond to. So I think it's a really worthwhile discussion to have, also in order to show people and decision makers that, there are some real requirements if you're going to talk about this. It's not just fuzzy gambling, as you started out saying, because you can do that without talking about experiments, I guess.
But you've never. So you say this is a sign of hubris when people start talking about it.
I think so. I mean, you can always say that, okay, we're going to try some things. There's a lot of uncertainty, ambiguity, all these things. So we're going to try some things that we think have a high likelihood of success. You can even sort of have a control group, because that part of the country doesn't have a lot of spread of disease right now. So maybe we can compare. You can talk about things like that. But once you formalize it in the way that Chris started us off, I think every politician knows that they're on pretty shaky ground, and the ethical dimension is going to come back and bite them.
Okay, so we're definitely going to come back to that ethical notion, which is always interesting in experiments, especially when in Germany, for instance, one lender does this and the other in the UK that happened. And but before we go anywhere, I see Paul. I think it's Paul. Is that right? Has materialized on our screen. So we're going to the UK and bring Paul in. Welcome, Paul. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yeah, so I think the answer to my question is going to be no, so it'll be a nice and quick one. Is there any evidence of the difference that it makes when governments go for obliging mask use or encouraging it? I mean, certainly in the UK right now, the suggestion I think is that as soon as you don't oblige it, people stop using them, even if it's advised.
Well, thank you for the question, Paul. I don't know if anybody knows, but I don't really know if anybody knows, because we've been talking about face masks, and this brings in, of course, the measurement. How do you measure feedback in times of crisis, which are by definition defined by uncertainty? So there is this, the whole idea of crisis is that you don't know and you can't know, and then. How can we design an experiment then? Chris, I know you know the answer to that one.
That's a hard one. Well, I would say, you know, going back to my framework is, you know, I think we know how to design controlled experiments, but the point is that they have to be done in very specific circumstances if you're going to learn something from them in the way that you anticipate that you can. So there's a lot of requirements for how you design a controlled experiment, you know, how to do a survey experiment. You know, I think you could probably answer Paul's question. Hi, Paul, by the way. But, you know, maybe with survey experiments or something like that. But part of my point was that design experiments have a very different setup, and you know the kind of knowledge, quote unquote knowledge, you yield from a design experiment and prototyping is going to be different than, you know, the setup for a survey experiment or a natural experiment. So I don't know if that's not really an answer, but that's kind of first thing that I have. My first response.
But if you formulate all these criteria, I mean, is it is it possible then? Do you think it's feasible?
Is it feasible? I think, you know, it depends. Again, kind of depends on what you mean. Can you do randomized controlled experiments during a crisis? I think the answer is yes. Okay. At what scale can you do them, and for what questions? That's a much harder issue. I think, you know, for a lot of things maybe we care about, you know, making decisions on quickly during a crisis, we probably don't have time or the ability to set up a randomized control trial. Or now that, you know, a lot of what we do in policy making is trial and error, I think. Even if, like Frederick said, you know, decision makers don't admit it, they're doing things and then they're learning from what they do, and then they're making some changes. The point I would make there about how that's different than is that kind of trial and error learning is often very retrospective. It's not really done with the intention of learning. You just do the best thing you can think to do that makes sense, or that is culturally appropriate, or that it's politically feasible in a specific point in time. You do that, and then you learn from the results. So it's kind of trial and error, but that's very retrospective. It's not a very systematic. It's not a systematic strategy of experimentation.
But I'm going to push you one step further, Chris. Just or is the mailman ringing your door? Well, Dr. Lodge is going to join us, so this is going to be fun. But before we get there, so Chris, if I were a politician and I want to know if a lockdown works, okay, and so I decide that city A, I'm going to impose a lockdown, in city B, I'm not going to impose a lockdown, and I'm going to hire you as my experiment designer. And you know, we don't have 3 months to think about this. So can you get me a design that works? Is it possible?
Sorry, the bells are my wife waking up. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm in a resort, Arjen, to my categories, because can I design a controlled experiment that would answer how lockdowns work, whether this lockdown style works or that lockdown style works? Yes, I could. That does start to raise ethical issues and control issues, like whether you can actually, you know, this goes back to Wolfgang's talk, whether you can actually control the variables you're thinking about. Well, I think but you could talk about doing it. Now, if you did it with a design strategy, I think that's kind of different, because your question implied that what we're trying to figure out is the causality of it. So is a lockdown effective to do X or not? That's a kind of a causal question. I think that's what controlled or experiments are trying to do. My view is that design experiments are not trying to do that. They're not trying to establish causality. or an evidence base. What they're trying to do is they're trying to find out, are there ways to do a lockdown that might work in this particular context? So could I work with a local public agency and kind of help them, work with them to think about what might work in their community? That would be more like a design experiment. And I think, yes, you could do that as well. It would require their interest in interacting with you in that way.
Clear. We can hire Chris. That's what we're hearing. That's good.
Can I just quickly follow up on Paul's question? There is a Bangladeshi study where they have different villages with one imposing face masks and the other making it an advice voluntary. But then the question is the difference in effect, is that a consequence of the stringency, imposing versus advising, or is it a consequence of the extent of using face masks? So what are you measuring? But anyway, there is a study on this, and there is definitely a difference between imposing and advising.
Okay, Paul just disappeared, but before we go anywhere else, Reidar, I'll get back to you, but first I'm going to go to London, because we have, we have Dr. Lodge with us, coming from hours of teaching, but joining us, and I know, Martin, we were talking about what we talked about earlier, pragmatist sort of approach, experimenting yourself out of a box, versus a more principled approach. And and I know you have some thoughts on this, and so maybe you can share them with us.
Okay, so sorry, this is hour 15 of teaching out of 22 every week, which is called Research Intensive University in this place. When I and I were sort of pondering this principle versus pragmatist and so on, I mean, one question, which is stuck in my mind is basically whether, when we talk about these kind of differences, and we can talk about the limits of experimentation and all that, and just briefly on Chris's point, I think doing that requires a lot of confidence in the authority that you're dealing with, the possibility of getting timely information, the ability to timely intervene and response, and sort of the problems of time lags and so on, and sort of the ongoing nature of basically people's adjustments and so on, I think makes it really quite difficult to think about sort of, the context of an experiment. I mean, observing in my own existence there about sort of adjustment of people on a week by week basis, on the basis of the same level. To what extent do publics respond? To what extent, basically everyone responds to the intervention over time. They learn and adjust, and basically the strategies would have to adjust too. So I think there's sort of quite a lot of complexity here in sort of establishing this, right? I mean, we could talk about sort of different posters and all that through it too. But anyway, so that's sort of one part. So the limits of that. But what really sort of I pondered while I was standing in a non-face mask crowded London Underground, despite all these posters that people should be wearing masks, and there's a clear difference between those people over 50 who have jobs who wear masks and those who are under 50 and have other types of jobs which are not wearing masks. But I wondered about sort of maybe we're talking about two different dimensions here, and in this kind of distinction between pragmatist and principled. And one is sort of what I think is sort of focusing on the principled approach would be to say, on the one hand, there's sort of, you might call it sort of a very focused problem formulation, or let's call it a dominant paradigm. And here I think sort of the financial crisis is sort of the clear thing. So ask a central banker in 2008 what the problem is with the banking crisis, they would all shout moral hazard at you. And basically that's all there is, nothing else. So no experimentation, so in that sense, I'm all with you about experimentation, no other way of thinking about the problem or what kind of tools might there be sort of to deal with sort of a sort of a banking problem. It is a moral hazard problem, and basically the only tools that are therefore available is because of this dominant undisputed problem formulation, which then over time basically you might say sort of gets softened up and so on. But for me that is sort of and you might argue this let's put it like this, overemphasis on the second dimension on so basically you want to sort of over-insure yourself or, perform this particular type of error in terms of erring on the wrong side of caution in basically maximizing on this particular problem formulation. It seems to me that these kind of two things are sort of at the heart of a principled kind of approach. And that then raises a question about what is then the other stuff which we've been observing, and it seems to me that sort of, is the pragmatist approach then, the complete opposite, on both of these dimensions? So basically erring on the side of we'd rather have a bit more, so rather we are under-inclusive, let's say, and we basically encourage idea contestation, or can you be and what do we do then with the other two bits of this 2x2 table, which is now emerging here in my head in that sense. So, and it strikes me that, what we sort of discussed, Arjen, maybe, and here I'm sort of abusing, kind of my discretion now, is a lockdown, for example, would be, let's say, an erring on the side of maximizing on one value, but it basically also generates the conditions under which you can sort of have an idea contestation afterwards. So to create the conditions under which you can learn again, under conditions of great uncertainty when you don't know anything, basically. So it seems to me for experimentation, you need to know something about the problem, and you need to have some idea about sort of the technologies you have at your disposal. But if you're in a complete condition of uncertainty where politically it's impossible to do your reversals and so on, where administratively you're not able to do anything really much apart from sort of firefighting, it strikes me sort of this kind of erring on the side of caution, let's put it that way, while generating conditions under which you might say allow for information in order to restabilize the ship, so to speak, is sort of, somehow sits uneasily in this pragmatist versus principled kind of dimension that we had. And now I'm looking at myself on the crisis plan screen, which is scary. As an experience. So this is basically the only kind of thought I had in that sense, Ian.
Thank you, Martin. So a bit of a paradox there. An experiment requiring some knowledge about the problem, which in a crisis you might not have at all. So what does that mean? I have Mark Reinhardt here. I see Olivier coming from Paris. You want to go first, Mark? Sure. And so if you have a second, Olivier, and I'll have you next in line. Yeah, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi, everyone. Again, it's Mark. Hey, Chris. Hi, Martin. Hi, Reidar. Oh, anyway, the word experiments, I think, is taking us down a bit of a rabbit hole here. I don't think we're really talking about proper experiments. Those are unfeasible, unethical, et cetera. I think we should get back to the kind of pragmatic versus principled discussion here in terms of policymaking. And I mean, aren't we really talking about policy adjustments or incrementalism, not experimentation? Yeah, trial and error. And I think the reason we're talking about this is because there's a kind of expectation that we think from the citizens that they want the stereotypical leadership during crises, which is strong and resolute and, a sort of strong, dominant leader taking tough decisions. And maybe that works in September 11th, and on the front page of the Politics of Crisis Management book, it's got Giuliani and Bush sitting there triumphantly. But anyway, there's sort of expectation that's what the public wants. So when we talk about pragmatism, we're talking about getting the public used to or accustomed to more incremental trial and error kinds of policy behaviors, which flies in the face of what we think crisis management is. So isn't the question, prepping the public in an era of highly complex, uncertain crises that, we're going to take this step by step, everybody. So, and so what, it speaks to a few questions. What do we think the public expects? Is it still that kind of form of leadership? So just a few thoughts there.
Thank you, Mark. And then, of course, the question that builds on, and we should tackle here in a little bit, is how do you communicate this to the public? Right. And because that's also interesting in times of crisis, there are certain expectations, how leaders communicate. How do you tell them that you not know what you're doing and we'll just try something and see how that flies? Olivier.
Yeah, thank you. Two short comments on Chris's presentation, and then a question to Chris also. So hi, Chris. It's good to see you again. A first comment on your nuclear example. I was thinking, it's interesting because recently I have a PhD student who's working on this topic on Fukushima and how Fukushima has been turned into an experiment and saying, well, it wasn't an accident really, it was sort of an experiment and we can learn a lot from what happened in Fukushima to improve the safety of nuclear power plants. So there is a use of experimental language of experiment to justify, to normalize, as some would say, accidents in such a way to say, well, yeah, it was a big deal in Japan maybe, but for us, it's an experiment and we can learn from this. And sort of normalizing and making the idea of the accident acceptable. And that's also, I think, an interesting twist to the nuclear example. The second, I also wanted to go in your direction and saying there's very loose language. People talking about experiments are doing it in a very loose fashion. You've mentioned the media, but politicians also, and even experts. In France, I mentioned before the decision to establish a curfew in last October in France. Well, this was based, first of all, on mimetism, copying what the neighbors were doing, but also an idea that we had tested it in Guyana, French Guyana, and it worked. So if it works in French Guyana, it has to work in metropolitan France. Which was these were experts making this assumption, and you just didn't know where to start saying, wait, how comparable is French Guyana with French metropolitan France? But still, this was used as the argument to justify for the curfew, in which there was basically no data. I guess my question is, in your typology, where would you be ready to add a third category, or maybe fit it into one of your two categories, which is Garfinkel's notion of breaching experiments? I think what we're experiencing now is a breaching experiment. When you introduce a total lockdown in France for 2 months, this is radically new. This is a turn-on event. There's nothing like it before. Even when we introduce masks, in a sense, it's a breaching experiment. And we've been studying organizations precisely from this point of view, seeing what happens in an organization when suddenly everything normal falls apart and you have to sort of improvise. And what do you learn about organizations? What do you learn about societies? What do you learn about anything from this breaching experiment? So I was wondering if this could be a third element in a third category in your typology. Because I think for us, the real issue as researchers is how can we learn from what has been happening for the last year and a half? In the sense that most of many decisions taken or many organizational behaviors are radically new in many ways. And so how do we understand them? And maybe using breaching experiment as a category is a way of entering this question.
Chris, do you want to react to that?
Yeah, I'll just be quick so I don't monopolize things. And hi, Olivier. Good to thank you for your question. I'm just going to say kind of why I went down this road of thinking about what precisely an experiment is because I come out of this pragmatist tradition, and in the pragmatist tradition, experimentation is considered a good thing. But then I realized, well, all my colleagues around me are talking about experimentation, and they're talking about randomized controlled trials and survey experiments. And so what kind of experiment do I actually mean? What does pragmatism embrace as a type of experiment? And then that required me to kind of think about, the distinctions between different kinds of experiments. I actually kind of come down more on the design side of thinking. I think pragmatism is more on that prototyping model of experimentation. Really interesting point about breaching experiments. I did find one article, by the way, about thinking about COVID as a breaching experiment. So this is kind of cool. For those who don't know, Garfinkel's model was breaching experiment was you do something that kind of disturbs society, or maybe it's at a micro scale or maybe larger, but you do something to disturb society and then you see what happens. So the breach is it breaches certain norms that already exist, and I think I agree with you that COVID is a giant breaching experiment. I think it kind of, I don't know if it's a third category. I'd have to think more about it, Olivier, but I would say that it kind of fits my notion of what an experiment is, because I said experiment is an intervention that you take for the purpose, for the intention of learning. That's what a breaching experiment is. So interesting to think about whether it's actually different. I think a lot of what we are doing is learning retrospectively, and that's kind of why and that's why I kind of emphasize that. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Olivier. Let's go back to that. The ethical consequences of trying something here and maybe not there. And Wolfgang, I was listening to your talk, and I wasn't sure where you came down on this, because you thought about it. You thought about all the design parameters, and so if you would have to, and you said the lender were doing different things on. So in a way, you could treat this as a learning from this or that strategy. But where do you come down on this? Would you recommend it, or would you? Frederick says this is hubris and not a good idea. What do you think?
Well, my quick and blunt answer would be, never could a politician in a democratic system declare the way he or she is handling a crisis an experiment. So, and that is tightly connected to ethical issues. And just to give you an example, in the recent election campaign in Germany for the federal elections, there was one moment when the discussion started whether or not fully vaccinated people should still be subject to constraints and restrictions. And the chancellor of the candidate of the Social Democrats, who now, according to all likelihood, will become the next chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he made a remark that was certainly meant to mitigate the mood and to pacify people's disturbances in saying, well, why we, as the already vaccinated people, do not tell all the other people who are still not vaccinated, well, you know what, we did you the favor to play the guinea pigs for you in making you able to build confidence in the fact that vaccination is a good thing. And what followed was an outcry of public opinion, because that was perceived as being inappropriate and so cynical, And so you see, if you declare what in our definition would be, in retrospect, in Chris's sense, an experiment, which it might be, or as might be denoted, is in the perception of the general public, may easily turn out to be cynicism. And that's exactly what I mean. Nonetheless, the logic of an experiment has to be taken very seriously by politicians, because they know, there's always, they should know, they are supposed to know, that as soon as you are, practicing pragmatism, as soon as you deviate from what is standard operating procedures, as soon as you relativize the regular and formal institutions in their jurisdiction and so on and so forth, there is always a price tag on it. So there are the pros and cons, and there are the unintended consequences, and whether or not you are able to take that into account, whether or not you are honest enough to tell the public that that exactly is the case, is first an empirical question, and of course also a question of, credibility of democratically elected and responsible politicians. So again, that brings me to my earlier plea. We just do not know enough about all these things as far as the current crises are concerned. and we should do very much more research focusing on the actual processing through which both the crisis and the response of public policies emerged.
This is a very interesting point. I'm going to ask several people about this. Politicians being honest about this, and strikes me, from a distance that we have two British people here in the screen. That your Prime Minister Johnson is extremely honest in the sense that he says, we're gonna Liberation Day and people will die. And it was just announced as casually, and but we're moving on. So is this a prime example of being honest and as a politician about what you're doing, sort of, and then we'll just see what happens. Martin, I'm sure you have an idea about this.
Just wanted to suggest that the Scottish position should come first. Paul, maybe, and then I'll come in. But Paul, kind of give us a view from Scotland on the great British Prime Minister, because I think, I think the territorial dimension of British responses is something quite exciting too. But anyway, Paul, maybe.
Well, I suppose all I'll say is Boris Johnson is selectively honest, isn't he? He has a reputation for being frank. I don't think it's the same as honesty. I think his issue is he says things as soon as he thinks of them, and he doesn't think of the consequences. So that's not the same as being honest and authentic and that sort of thing. And I think it's the Scottish First Minister is often seen as the more authentic, sincere one in comparison. But while I'm here, I'll slip in the thing I was going to say, which is in the UK, it's the language of trial and error. Westminster systems are not particularly conducive to that kind of language, especially the UK. The narrative is the government knows best, we know what we're doing. So they can't really then say, okay, well, we were very uncertain, so let's try some things. But if you look at the minutes of the advice to the UK government in the run-up to the first lockdown, there was a very experimental language going on. Essentially, their advisors were saying, we think we have a good sense of which of these interventions would work the most, on the assumption that there's no way anyone's going to introduce them all. So let's introduce them gradually and see if we can measure their independent effects. And the same body then objected to the UK government releasing the lockdown en masse, because it said, we'll have no way of knowing which of these parts worked and which didn't, because you're bringing them all in and then bringing them all out. The other thing there is that kind of language and argument was, completely unsuccessful, so that there was a kind of experimental mood within a group of people who didn't really influence ministers that much.
Martin?
I think sort of, you may also wonder, under what extent, do people do things, being frank to a particular audience and hoping for other people to be more restrictive and so on, right? But I think I agree, but I think it sort of goes back to, what I sort of, my concern is this experimentalist language has really this idea that you can fine tune these things. Kind of this idea about we can sort of shepherd people into one corner and they will be all protected in a bubble. We use sort of language like that. Everything is under control seems to me, a highly technocratic kind of assumption about how people interact, that they're not creatively complying over time. Here I would just basically suggest, kind of how did people understand whether they were an essential worker or not, right? In Scotland, Paul, kind of understands that higher education teachers, such as myself, we are not essential workers as defined by Scottish legislation. In the English legislation, it is very open-ended whether it is applicable. So my employer wrote us an email that we should consider ourselves essential workers so that we could get rid of our children into various establishments. And that is why there was overcrowding in Oxford, right? But that was in the second round, not in the first round. So basically, so I think sort of the idea, I think, in a particular environment that you can use these sort of, we've got all these instruments, let's poke here, let's poke there, let's kind of directly sort of maneuver the curve, in exactly the way we do. I think this is sort of where, I think there's the limits of these kind of strategies in these kind of dynamic settings where you're not quite sure what you have, because I think that goes back to, Arjen, what you highlighted is my paradox, or maybe my inherent contradiction in myself. I think you can only use interventions if you have some clue about what's going on. If you're suddenly surprised that the situation looks very different, you may want to sort of throw everything at it in order then to basically create conditions under which you can then sort of maybe pull individual instruments out in order to see how you relax conditions rather than expand the kind of conditions. Which basically I just want to sort of say, back to Mark Reinhardt's comment. I think this all sounds very good, Mark, and I love your contribution, but I think bureaucracy has a big problem in being might not be incremental, but basically in being experimental or whatever you want to say. And, don't underestimate the problems of a bureaucracy to understand permanently changing rules. It is not just political leaders who don't like U-turns. Bureaucracy likes to make things simple, have clear categories, and not basically deal with sort of highly discretionary kind of questions, because ultimately that also then has implications for general acceptance of the population. I mean, the regulation person in me would say this is all about governing through principle-based rather than rule-based kind of systems and so on. But I think, this requires a very consistent kind of message within discretion operates. And I think bureaucracies are not up for this kind of system.
Thank you, Martin. So this is an intense discussion and not the easiest thing. So we have a practitioner here, Hape, and he's been involved for years in the national crisis management machinery in Holland as a very senior practitioner. So first of all, I wonder if you can make any sense of what we're doing here.
Oh, yeah, sure.
No, that's very kind.
And at Leiden University, in my
of
past,
course.
so I think
Yeah.
prepared.
Is the microphone on? Can I check with the people, volume people? Yeah. Okay. Cool.
No, so my remark would be that early on in the crisis, our prime minister here in the Netherlands made the remark that the cabinet had to base 100% of the decisions on 50% knowledge, which actually was pretty optimistic, I think. But saying so, he indicated early on that actually we were in an experiment without using that word. And it's been much quoted during the whole crisis in the past 1.5 years. And especially the Dutch researchers on the panel know there have been quite a few reversals using masks on the closing intelligently or non-intelligently down our society. And I think each time these decisions were based on progressive knowledge about what was going on and on experiences in other countries. And I think in our opinion, but I would like to know what you think about it from the outside, that these reversals were possible and eventually also accepted by the public, because early on we had indicated that we were kind of in an experiment. So that is a little bit from the inside perspective, but maybe you have a different opinion about that. I would like to hear.
So the point being there was the groundwork being laid by communicating early on in the crisis. We don't know, so we're doing our best, essentially, and which created room for U-turns. And so I'm going to have. But first, I want to hear the Swedish perspective on this, because there were no U-turns in Sweden, I think, at least none that we could observe from afar. So what does that mean? And then Sanneke is going to react on this case. So Frederick.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. It seems to me that nobody really wants to die on the hill defending pragmatism. So even if you start out saying that we're going to be pragmatic, we recognize uncertainty, we're going to try some stuff here, doesn't work, we'll try something else. I think the problem here is what Chris started out by calling the intervention that you need in order to put the experiment in motion, because that requires a political investment, right? So you do something, and you're seen doing something, and it gets a life of its own, and at some point you're going to have to defend that. You can't just say, well, we just tried anything, it didn't work, we'll try something else. So I think you can defend the approach of doing this, and I think you can talk about uncertainty, although it takes some courage, because most governments don't talk a lot about uncertainty. But sooner or later, the response is going to be more and more rigid. At least that's what we've seen. That's what I've seen in the Swedish way. I mean, a lot of people think that they, maybe not U-turns, but turns. I don't know what to call them, but, you know, the public, they don't see that. They see more of the same, right? And so pragmatism becomes impotence in a way. And that's sort of a dangerous position to be in for a policymaker, and that makes it sort of an uncomfortable position to be in, and so you become more and more principled in defense of your approach. That's the very pessimistic view of mine on pragmatism in action.
So very interesting, because you're saying, you know, the political price tag is simply too high, even though Hape was saying, you know, there was a payoff. So there might be a cultural dimension to this, in some, even though Sweden. So I'm confused, but in a good way. So Sanneke, what do you think?
Well, I was thinking there's still two or maybe several ideas of experimenting going on here, because on the one hand I hear imposing different restrictions on different groups, like the clinical experiment, the randomized control trial, which I agree with Wolfgang is not ethical. You can't impose or take away people's rights in one Bundesland and not in the other. When you think something is really beneficial, you should lean in and go for it. It would be publicly and also, it would be unacceptable to not impose interventions if you think really that that's the way to go about. Just for the sake of the experiment. But the other thing is trial and error, just being frank that you don't know exactly what the effect of your intervention will be, what H.P. Schrijnemacher said, and that is, I think, acceptable to the public. And I think, for instance, after all, the UK is experimenting. One hypothesis still stands that the Queen and Keith Richards are still alive. But I mean, you can impose a wide variety of. I knew you would bite on this one. Anyway, so you can impose any type of policy intervention as long as you, I think, uniformly communicate about it, put in your entire political weight behind it, and not waver while imposing it.
Okay, well, we're getting different viewpoints on this, and to add to the confusion, we have, which I'm sure will happen, Roland, help us out.
Yeah, thanks. Now, I was wondering a little bit about the different, two things actually. One is there is I would say a difference between front stage and backstage appearances of governments. Whereas on the front stage, I think we generally would think that there needs to be consistency somehow and logical explanations, etc. In the backstage, different things can happen, and that might also happen to different types of publics. So it's a good pragmatist tradition to differentiate between publics. And to give you an example, our health inspectorate, or the chief inspector, actually, she gave a webinar early in the first wave of the pandemic to the Federation of Medical Specialists, in which she said, well, you know, the inspectorate is now going to leave it to you. We're not going to control you as we would normally do, but we're going to leave you, and we're going to call you occasionly to ask what you're doing, how you're experiencing it, what kind of problems you're experiencing, and to form a platform, in a sense, to share knowledge also between what is happening in different healthcare organizations. And I thought, in terms of Chris Ansell's types of experimentation, that might be called even a generative form of experiment, what was happening there, in the sense that that this platforming and the sharing of knowledge between different healthcare organizations was actually generative in the sense that people learn to do things differently and learn from each other. But that, of course, was targeted towards a very specific public of healthcare professionals, not so much to the general public of citizens abiding or not abiding by specific rules. So that might, but I think it's good to differentiate that a little bit.
Thank you. Reidar, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that one thing we also need to be thinking about is the potential that these kinds of experiments have for creating scandals and therefore become very unattractive for authorities. Like, for example, in the start of the crisis, many public agencies, even ministries, public health institutes didn't know the limits of their mandate, so to speak. So many studies that were initially carried out, for example, in Norway, were later banned and deemed unethical or illegal, and that creates, of course, political storms. But luckily for our decision makers, like Mark said, a creeping crisis consists of so many crises that one crisis is very quickly swept to the back and disappears. But I think that almost every major research project that the government did in Norway were shut down. Like, for example, looking at movement patterns, efforts at checking how many people on trains are wearing masks. All of that was found to be unethical, even though they happen in a kind of naturalistic, experimental sense, because you're not really telling people not wearing masks or wearing masks, just monitoring or counting how many people are behaving according to recommendations. So you're looking at how many people are in this area, how many people are at the mall. But all of that is then unethical, and then the government basically will take the stance that most research is unethical, and therefore, experiments are not politically feasible to do. So I think that also the relationship between authorities and the courts are important to take into account here, because, like, if the courts find that all of these experiments are illegal or unethical, then what can the government do if even naturalistic experiments are unethical?
Thank you, Reidar. Well, I'm really struck by the sort of tension between designing and thinking about these approaches in our academic ivory towers, and then the people just saying, well, it's just not going to fly politically. It's just impossible to do these things, even if there would be a rationale for it. So Fredrik basically said, this is hubris. This is how you start. I don't think you change your mind on this. No, that's what I thought. I know Martin. He worded it. It's interesting that our Dutch practitioner here seems to be saying that, in a way, the Dutch approach kind of resembled this, even though. So I'm not sure if we got any further in this discussion. Oh, somebody's going to help us out. That's good. And we have a few more minutes. So Jörg, please.
My observation is that the whole discussion is now framed very much in the COVID-19 crisis. But if we talk about climate change, for example, policy experiments that do not directly affect people's health will be hopefully possible also in other areas. So maybe to the end, the question to the panelists, if you think about different crises and different policy fields where people's health and life are not directly involved, is that possible then, right? I mean, you sort of touched upon it in terms of the ethical standards, but that was very much still framed in the COVID-19 crisis. But if we think about climate change, for example, if you introduce certain behavioral changes, I wouldn't know why we wouldn't try that.
That's an excellent observation. We've been caught in the COVID and different types of crises, maybe different types of opportunities. Chris.
Thanks. Yeah, that actually brings up a good point for me, because I was also thinking about experimentation and creeping crises, and what I have looked at a lot is the role of experimentation in climate change, and there's now just a huge literature on experimentation for sustainability transitions. And I don't think it doesn't raise quite the same moral objections as I think we've been talking about here. So just to kind of put it, an example of this, let's say a government, in fact, the Dutch government has been extremely experimental in developing sustainability transitions. It basically says we're going to create this program where we fund a lot of different pilot projects in different communities that try to do develop different strategies in their communities for sustainability. And, these we will aggregate up and try to find out what lessons we can learn from these. So I think there are other contexts when you're talking about making a decision about somebody's health, whether they have to get a vaccine or not. Experiments become really kind of scary. But I think in many contexts the language is not that scary to people, and policymakers can talk about it. So I would just say that in a creeping crisis like climate change, there's lots of evidence of governments being experimental.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic observation. So, brings us back to the creeping crisis. So there's more time, obviously, and maybe a good strategy also in a creeping crisis, when to sort of ease people into the idea that we have to do something, but use different methods. And what do you think, Fredrik? Is that better? Fredrik, I can tell, is done with all this, and so we're at the end of a long day, and I think this is a good moment to start, unless somebody has a very pressing, really cool comment to end all this with, and look, nobody's volunteering. Then I want to thank our panelists for getting up early, staying long with us. Chris, Martin, Reidar, thank you so much. This was and of course here, Sanneke and Wolfgang, very rich panel. Fredrik, of course. So many people weighing in on this, and I think it's inspirational. I'm not sure we solved it, and that would be weird, but certainly inspirational to continue the discussion on this. So thank you so much, and we wish you a great day on the different continents.